Yeah, so it is recording. And hello, everyone. Welcome to the seminar series of the Research and Study Group in Environmental Psychology at the HSC. Today, we're delighted to have with us Caroline Verfuerth, if I'm correct pronouncing. Caroline is a research associate at Cardiff University in the United Kingdom. She is also an active part of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations at Cardiff University. And Caroline will present today research based on her PhD that she has completed some time ago. And we are very happy to and looking forward to, very happy to have Caroline with us today and looking forward to your seminar, your talk. Thank you.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited about hearing that there's a new environmental psychology group and to meet you all and see what research you're doing. So yeah, I'm going to talk a bit about my PhD research, and I'm planning to talk about half an hour or so, and then I'm very happy to take questions. But if there's anything you don't understand, or if I talk too fast or anything, then please let me know. But yeah, so I completed my PhD a year and a half ago. And so this is some of the core research that I've been doing. So I looked at, in the broader sense, transforming lifestyles, and more specifically, I looked at food choices, behavior change, so in the form of interventions, and spillover effects. And I'm going to talk about two core sort of papers that I took out from my study. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, so just a brief introduction for those of you who don't know what spillover is. So essentially, and specifically, I look at contextual spillover. So the idea is when one behavior leads to another. So spillover effects describes when one pro-environmental behavior leads to another secondary behavior. And this can, for example, be done by having a behavior change intervention, for example, in the workplace. That's where I did mine. And I look at whether this affects pro-environmental behaviors at home. I'm going to talk you through what kind of intervention I did and what behaviors I looked at. That's sort of like the broad idea. And so spillover effects between pro-environmental behaviors, they have been widely studied. For example, when people look at whether when someone recycles, if they also save energy. So there are some references on some of the research that has been done in this area. But we don't know too much about how this between different contexts and home context are particularly interesting, because we spend so much time at work, maybe not during COVID, but like before and probably in the future as well. And then what we do there, whether that affects what we do at home. And the reason why I think this is really interesting is because you can reach people who might not be otherwise interested in pro-environmental behaviors. For example, if a company decides to do something pro-environmental, and does like a program or an intervention in the workplace, it would be really interesting to see whether this changes, for example, how people do things at home. And we also know very little about the influence on contextual spillover effects. So what factors influence this? And I'll go into this a little bit more in a minute. So my two key questions really, and I'm focusing here on food choices, are what are the facilitators and barriers to contextual spillover effects, and what role of identity, what is the role of identity for contextual spillover? I'm focusing on food because it's one of the behaviors that's really difficult to change, and we do it every day. So we eat every day, we make these choices every day, and it's actually been a behavior that's been really understudied as well, particularly in the context of as a pro-environmental behavior. So that's why I saw a bit of a gap. And I found a company to work with where we developed a program for them in their canteen. And essentially what we did is we set it up as a quasi-experimental design. I did a mixed methods approach. So this is basically a company that's based in Sheffield, which is where I did my PhD in the north of England. And I did surveys and interviews. What I'm presenting today is the interview data, so the qualitative data, because that was actually way more interesting. But I've done both. And what I've done is I did interviews and surveys with employees of this company. And then we did an intervention. That means I went together with the chef of the canteen, and we reduced the availability of meat in the canteen by 70%. And we also developed an information campaign. And then I did a survey and interviews with people again. And I asked them a lot about like what they think of sustainability, what they think of food and sustainable food choices. And I also asked them what they do at home. So it's kind of the context of this study. So for the intervention, so the information campaign we designed was focusing on two core messages. One is eat less meat, and particularly red meat, and eat more vegetables and fruit, particularly seasonal and local. So I designed these posters that were sort of shown to people, and they were sort of spread out in the canteen. They were around for 2 weeks. So I mean, yeah, this is what they looked like. So they had some information on like little quizzes and sort of information around the impact of different food choices on the environment, and they kind of had a repeated sort of message. The core message was repeated on these. That there were more than these. These are just some examples. And then we also changed the food in the canteen. So this is what it looked like before. I don't know if you're very familiar with British food, but basically what they had is like an open buffet in the canteen for the employees, and they were all able to eat there for free. So that's sort of like one of the advantages for working in that company. And so, but the food that they had was mostly making sandwiches, and they had a lot of meat options. So for example, of ham, turkey, and lots of different cold cuts of meat. And we changed that by reducing the availability of meat. So we really drastically reduced it by 70% and gave them like tofu, sweet potato salad, aubergine. So together with the chef, we developed this. So I just want to go through some of the key findings. So first, I'm going to talk a bit about positive spillover that we saw. This is from the interview data. So we saw that people talked about, and this is where I did a template analysis on the interview data with the people and looked at how things have changed from before to after. So we found that there was a reduced meat consumption at home. So for example, this person says, we're trying to do the meat-free Mondays. So that's what they're trying to do at home. They also ate more local produce because they, for example, here it says it is easier to get locally produced vegetables than to eat less meat. And then people were also more interested in looking for information around, like when they went shopping in the supermarket, to sort of look at sustainability indicators. However, and this is sort of concurrent with the literature, there's also a lack of change, and this is sort of very normal. So people said that they didn't change anything, but it was really interesting to get an insight, whereas a lot of the studies previously on spillover have done surveys. They only found that this isn't happening, like spillover doesn't happen. But by doing the interviews, I feel like I got a good insight on why it didn't happen. So, for example, people did justifications for not reducing their meat consumption. For example, this person says, I'm a meat eater, and that is something that has always been instilled in me. That's going to be the tastier option. And so this this person, she was like, well, I'm a meat eater, so I can't change. And therefore it had no effect on her, which was super interesting to hear. And another thing is that people reaffirmed past behavior. So for example, this participant said, I've always bought British produce. Now I realize how good it is to get stuff locally as opposed to the other end of the planet. So basically he justifies not changing his behavior by saying, oh, I've always done the green thing anyway. So but coming back to my main question, so one thing I wanted to find out a bit more was like, what are the facilitators and barriers to the contextual spillover? So why does it happen? Why does it not happen? And this is just to give you a flavor. And I've already put like a little link down, that not a link, but like a reference down there. This is one of the papers I published on this, so where we kind of really dig deeper into the different barriers and facilitators. But I wanted to highlight two here because I think they're quite interesting. So one thing is that the differences between contexts act as a barrier to spillover, to positive spillover. So you can maybe imagine things you do at home and you do at work. It's different. So the context is different. And this participant talks about it. She says, at work, I mean, you know, people do what they do and it's up to them really. I look after other things. At home, I can influence my family. So there's that difference between the contexts. And then another one is to do with differences in the perceived control, where the workplace is perceived different to the home. So they overlap, but this is more specifically about where people feel in control. So this person said, I guess I try harder at home because at work, even if I do something really well, then someone else comes and ruins it. Whereas at home, I'm in control of what happens. So I thought that was really interesting, that this control aspect seems to play a huge role. There are more facilitators and barriers that we identify. And again, this is the article where we discussed this. And we also developed a typology of spillover facilitators and barriers and some practical implications. So we talk a bit about which ones are self-dependent, other dependent, and context-dependent, because it seems like some things depend more on others, for example, or on the context or on the self. And if you're interested, that's where you can read up more about it. And then, so the next question, I just want to briefly dive into that one as well, is what is the role of identity for contextual spillover? Because there's a lot of research that has focused on identity as a factor that can influence spillover effects more generally. So what I did is I kind of developed, or I took some of the literature and sort of continued or applied a theoretical model. And I'm just gonna go through this. If you have any questions later, I know like these models can sometimes be, these theoretical frameworks can sometimes be a bit much, but I tried to explain exactly what I did. So the literature said, for example, that green identity is a predictor for positive spillover. So this relationship has been found before. So you have a behavior change intervention, for example, at work. The literature says, okay, this influences someone's pro-environmental identity or self-identity, and that then leads to spillover. So the idea is that identity is the factor in between. So I was really interested in what that actually means, what happens to one's identity. And so I looked at different identity theories, and I found one called identity process theory by Glenys Breakwell. And she essentially explains the process of identity change, which I thought was really interesting because different identity theories, maybe you're familiar with some, have different assumptions of what identity is and whether it changes or not. And the idea here is that through an assimilation, adaptation, and evaluation of behavior or information, so this would then change the identity or how central certain aspects are. So essentially, what I thought, okay, if there's a behavior change intervention at work, for example, this is something people don't do voluntarily. This is just what the workplace does. That this then means people get this new information and they have to deal with it somehow. And they either, I'll explain that in the next step. And so I thought that what happens here might then explain how spillover happens. So we kind of take this, there are essentially three parts of what could happen. And this is based on the idea that spillover can, according to the literature, happen in three ways. So there's negative spillover, which is essentially that you do something, a pro-environmental behavior in one context or in one pro-environmental behavior, and then you do in a non-pro-environmental behavior, like the opposite after. There's also a lack of spillover, as I already explained, where just nothing happens, no change. And then there's positive spillover, where one behavior leads to another. So that's like the broad idea. So the idea, according to this theory then is, or how I applied it, is that if you have like a behavior change intervention, and in my case, I took away the meat, a lot of the meat from the people in the canteen. So that could really be conflicting with people if they say, oh, I'm a meat eater, someone is taking away my meat, and then they don't like that. So I thought this could lead them to conflicting identities and let them deny the things. So they don't like what's happening. And that then means the concept of, for example, the pro-environmental behavior or sustainability becomes less central to the self because they deny it, they reject it. This then leads to compensatory behavior. This is something that the literature also has observed in the past, that people do compensatory behaviors to make, like, compensate for pro-environmental behaviors. For example, if you have had a meat-free day, you might think, oh, I can eat a lot of meat now. And that's sort of what I'm trying to explain with this here. Then there is the one for lack of spillover. And this is something that the literature is really not understanding too well yet. But the idea is that there could be a one-off behavior change. So people at work might be happily eating no meat, but then when they come home, they don't even think about it anymore. They have no future actions. And the idea here is that they compartmentalize it so that they separate the behavior from the identity so that they don't even think about it. Then a third one is that they integrate it. So that there's an environmental identity that becomes more salient and that then becomes more central to the self. So they almost absorb this behavior and it becomes part of their identity. And then they want to act like consistent with the future environmental behaviors. And that's why they increase doing pro-environmental behaviors elsewhere. And that's then also why we observe positive spillover. I know this is a lot, but I explained it more in another paper, which I'm showing you the reference to in a minute, but that's sort of like the gist of it. And I just briefly wanted to show you how I measured it, because this is sort of like a new measure we developed for this to sort of measure the centrality of identity. So in the interviews before and after the intervention, I gave people like a little person, as you can see there, and told them, okay, imagine this is yourself. And then I gave them these three terms or concepts and say, okay, now you place them. If it's really central to you, place it closer to the person. And if it's really not central to who you are, place it further away. And then I wanted to see how that changes after the intervention. And that's one of the qualitative analysis I did. And I thought that was really interesting to see what's happening there. So for example, I looked at environmental friendly self, and then I looked at it, the second one is at a later point, and it looks like it's become more central because it's covering more of that person. In this case, sustainability, the concept, also becomes closer to the person set in this case, and this one also comes closer. So in this case, I would assume the person has increased the centrality of these three concepts to the self. That's reflected in this implicit task. So the people weren't shown so I asked them the first time, they did the task, I photographed it, and then the second time round after the intervention, I showed it to them again, but they didn't see what they answered the time before. So this is how I tried to implicitly measure sort of the change. And just to show you two examples on how this has worked in line with the theory. So this is sort of the chunk of the theory, and I'm focusing only on the positive and the lack of spillover ones because I found more interesting findings here. So again, here we're assuming that the behavior change intervention would then lead to an integration of the environmental identity, that it becomes more salient, becomes more central to the self, and then leads to consistent pro-environmental behaviors, and that is then labeled positive spillover. So, to sort of evidence this part, here's a quote of what this person said, and I'll show you the visualization in a minute. But so this person said, we're trying to do the meat-free Mondays, and that will then spill over to either the Tuesday or Wednesday because we have got leftovers to eat as well. So this person talks about the meat reduction that they've done at home. So this is what we would label as positive spillover because this comes as a direct result from the behavior change intervention at work. And to sort of look at whether the centrality of the concepts changed, I looked at these, and this is the one I've just shown you as well. So here we can see that all three terms become closer to the little mannequin, and that's what we would then interpret as being more central. So we would take this as essentially for the change in the centrality to the self. Yes. I have another example here. This is to do with a theme around lack of spillover, about reaffirmation of previous behavior. And this is a bit more tricky, but I think it's still quite interesting. So again, we would assume that people won't change any future behaviors at home because they sort of do the thing once, in this case in the workplace, but they won't do anything else in the future. And I think, so just to read out the quote, I think for me, it just reaffirmed my beliefs in getting things locally and just trying to find other ways helping to reduce CO2 emissions. I will never be able to cut meat completely because of my diet. So this person essentially says, well, he won't change, but it reaffirmed his beliefs and he's always been doing it right. So it's a reaffirmation of previous behavior. As you can see here, and this is maybe a bit more tricky, but they're all quite central, and they got a bit closer. So the concept of sustainable food got closer, but the other ones didn't really change all that much. And so that's just to illustrate a little bit of what we did there. You can read, if you're interested in this, we did a whole paper on this exact thing. So these figures are actually from the paper, and it's an open access one as well in Frontiers in Psychology. And so what we did there is we have an analysis of the identity process theory, a more thorough one, and the theory is more explained as well. And we're using the qualitative interview data and the visual data as well to sort of explain this more. So I'm happy to answer any questions at the end of this talk as well. So I just wanted to acknowledge a few limitations of the study overall. So this is all coming from one study. It's quite complex because it included a real world behavior change intervention, which is actually quite rare in the environmental psychology literature. And I see why, because they're really hard to implement and it's really difficult to get good sample data. So like my sample size is really small. I've only had 14 people that I interviewed. I interviewed them twice, so it makes it a bit stronger. And I did some survey surveys as well, which I didn't go into here. I mean, some obvious ones are like there could be a self-selection in the interview sample because I interviewed more people in the first before the intervention than after, and the people who dropped out sort of were less interested in the topic. And then this is obviously quite explorative explorative research. So there's a new method we tried. There's an application of a different theory to explain identity processes, and further validation really is needed to sort of consolidate this. And I think longitudinal measures would be really amazing. So as part of my PhD, I couldn't do it, but it would have been really nice to talk to the people again 6 months later or a year later and see if there were any other ripple or spillover effects to anything else. A few implications for interventions, because I think that's quite interesting as well, because yeah, we're trying to design successful interventions, and I think we can learn something from this study. So one thing is that what we found is the differences between the different settings. So, and this is sort of what was found in other research as well, as you can see here in the references. But behavior change interventions, I think it's important to try to reduce differences between the settings and to try to link them up so that people don't see it so much as a disconnect or barrier. Then a second thing is the perceived behavioral control that I talked about. So I think it's really important to empower the recipients of the intervention so that they can be taking part in it, can maybe be involved in developing it. And I think this would really increase the spillover effects from what I've seen and what people talked about, what they're interested in, how much they want to engage and how invested they are as well. So that's something we could learn from it. And then the last one, I think this is really important as well. So in psychology, we often see individuals as disconnected people or individuals, but the context is so important, and particularly the social dynamics. And I didn't go into too much just now, but there is something called ecological resocialization. So what I found is that family members, for example, can act as barriers. If people want to change their food consumption at home, they can't do it because maybe their partner or another family member doesn't want to do it. So they are sort of barriers to this. But it could also be that people are really interested and then everyone wants to do it at home, and then it's sort of encouragement. I think this is really important to consider. So yes. Then a few implications for spillover theory. So I think identity process theory is really interesting and can be potentially used, can be a useful approach to understanding spillover effects. So I think it would be interesting to apply it to other contexts and to other research. Really, it's not the easiest one to get your head around, and it's also not so easy to measure, but I think it has some real value to understanding, especially spillover effects. And then another implication, I think, for spillover theory we can take from this research is the lack of spillover is more complex than just an absence of spillover. So I think that there are a lot of processes going on, such as the reaffirmation, and then there are lots of other things I identified that I talk about in my papers on this topic. And I think that can be a real eye-opener to understanding that it's not just lacking of a continued pro-environmental behavior, but that there are actually mechanisms in place and things happening. So, and then implications for understanding diet choices. As I said already, this is quite an under-researched area, and I think what we can learn from this intervention, at least, is that changing diet choices is actually somewhat context dependent, and it's sort of quite a difficult thing as well. So yeah, it's just one of the harder behaviors to change because it really inconveniences the habits of a lot of people, I think, like what they want to eat. then reducing meat consumption seems to be strongly linked to identity for some people. So you already saw how some people talked about, oh, I'm a meat eater, therefore I do this, or oh, I'm not a vegetarian, therefore I can't eat that food. I thought that was super interesting. So that gives us an indication of understanding diet choices as well, as a pro-environmental behavior. And then I think more research is needed to understand food choices as part of a low carbon lifestyle. So I think this is still, in the context of pro-environmental behaviors, this is still not being researched a lot. So, I mean, there's lots of future research, I think, that can be done on this topic, but I think it would be really good to test some implications for behavior change interventions, because I think that's really where we need to get going. It would be interesting to see transferability to other areas, for example, to mobility or plastic use or any of the areas of behavior change, and see if, for example, the application of the identity process theory actually is similar in those other areas, or if it's exclusive to the area of food. And then I think ethnographic studies would be really interesting if to observe the social dynamics, for example, in a home and work setting as an approach. Also, like more quantitative research would be really useful as well. That's on that. I just wanted to quite briefly mention that the current work that I'm doing with my colleagues in CAST, so where we look at a much broader, and this is sort of somewhat connected as well, so we look at a much broader topic of what could low carbon transformed futures look like, and we're interested in sort of how people envisage to live in the future, and how that could be done in the UK and across other countries. So I'm leading the project where we look at Brazil, China, and Sweden, and we look at, we do workshops with people and talk, among other things, about how diet changes would affect what we're doing, and how we would want to do this in the future. So I think my PhD research sort of like is really zoomed in and at a broader and more global and zoomed out perspective. It feeds in quite well into here. So, but yeah, so that's what we're doing at the moment. And yeah, that's it from me. Thanks very much for listening, and let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Caroline. I think this was a really interesting research. It's very rich, and it's quite unusual, I guess, in the sense that it's qualitative and it involves an intervention. There are very few studies like that, I think, in the field of, environmental psychology and applied social psychology as well. So that's really wonderful. And, in future, we would be really interested to hear also about the current project that you are working on, when you have the findings available and when you are ready to talk. Maybe, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I was just going to say it'd be super interesting, because we're doing, well, I'm working on the international comparisons project, and that would be, I mean, naturally super interesting to, I don't know, maybe even expand to some of the workshops in Russia if you would be interested in doing that. But I think we could do a different.
Yeah, we can discuss this definitely. Yeah. I'll probably start with a couple of quick questions. Well, first of all, it was really interesting to see about the measure that you've developed, the identity and centrality of identity. And one of the things that you've mentioned that you could probably clarify for later is the typology of barriers and facilitators. I would really like to hear a little bit more on this. And also, we have this kind of, usual question about spillover, surrounding spillover, as we also did some research on this, is it spillover, is it spill under, or is there none? Yeah, but you also introduce here a nuance in the sense that you say that the lack of spillover is more complex than the absence of spillover, and I would really like you to comment on that, please.
Yes, yeah. So to your first one, I thought the question could be around the typology, and this is essentially the table. Can you see that okay, actually?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this is the table we put in the paper, and I didn't want to put it in the presentation because it's a lot to go through, but what you can see is you can see the type of spillover at the top. So you have the facilitators that we identified of positive contextual spillover. That's like the first column. Then the barriers to positive contextual spillover, resulting in a lack of spillover. So that's sort of how I talked about it. And then recommendations for policymakers and practitioners. And then, so we have, for example, if you take the first row, we have self-dependence. So here we identified, for example, perceived lack of control over pro-environmental behavior change. So this is, for example, compromising in changing to different pro-environmental behavior, where people say, oh, well, I can't control the food I eat, like reducing meat, but then I can control where my food is coming from. That was like a common one that led to positive spillover. It's like a facilitator, and it's self-dependent. So that's how I said it would be. If you look at other dependent, is where you do compensatory behaviors. So for example, if we maybe go into the barriers to positive spillover, which would then possibly lead to lack of spillover, is there are differences in perceived behavioral control between the work and the home context. And I know it sounds similar to just perceived behavioral control, but in the research we did, it seemed like they are two separate, overlapping but separate things. So people might feel like they're in control in one context, but not in the other. And that is because of other people. So that's why it's other dependent. And then maybe a context dependent one is, I don't know, for example, if we're still with the barriers, physical differences would be one. So different facilities or equipment, for example. So this has been identified in the literature as well, and this is clearly context dependent. If you look at the facilitator, sort of perceived easiness of behavior change. So if there were lots of labels on the food of where it's from or what carbon footprint it has, that would basically make it a lot easier. So this is sort of where you have the nudging kind of interventions that would help. So that's one of the recommendations we made here, based on that. But yeah, I mean, you should have the slide pack available and papers available as well, where this is explained in more detail. But I hope it gives you a bit of an impression on how we did that typology, and then made recommendations for policymakers and practitioners. Do you have any more questions about this, or does that sort of answer?
Well, I don't. I think it's really interesting. I think it's an excellent summary, and there is a lot to process here. So maybe one day we can discuss this. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, you wanted to also know. Sorry, what were your other questions?
Yeah, the second question was regarding the. If you could speak a little bit about the difference between why lack of spillover is more complex than the absence of spillover.
Yeah, so I mean, when you just look at the literature, and obviously for all of you who are doing a PhD, you actually become real experts in the literature that you focus on, you realize later. There is not very much on spillover, essentially on the lack of spillover. It seems that a lot of the studies just say, oh yeah, we didn't find spillover effects. And then there are a few studies, a few experiments that try to explain why, but there is really not very much evidence. So oftentimes you have studies that look at positive spillover, because that's what we would like to see, because it would be so easy if we did an intervention or a campaign or information provision, and then people would just change everything else as well. Or we could ask people to get smart meters at home, and then maybe they drive less with their car. So that's sort of the idealized version of how we see spillover effects. But why people don't do it, I think, yeah, I've just seen in the interview data really a lot of evidence for these thought processes. And I think, I mean, I'm sort of a I'm a mixed methods researcher, but I'm a bit of a converted qualitative researcher, I have to say, because I think that I was trained very much as a quantitative researcher, but I've come to really appreciate the depth that you get from qualitative data and just speaking with people and insights you get. And so this gave me a bit of an insight into the thought processes people had. So for example, as I showed you, where people are like, oh yeah, I could change this behavior, but well, I'm already doing quite a lot of things anyway. I didn't realize how much I was already doing. They relabel it as, oh, I've already been doing pro-environmental behavior, therefore I don't have to change anything. But this is obviously a process that's happening, but we don't see it if we just do a survey before and after. If we don't, it still results in no spillover effects in that case. But there's like a thought process that's happening. But that might be quite different to someone who's sort of like, I don't know, sort of just detaching themselves from the behavior altogether, where they're like, oh, at work I do one thing, at home I do another thing, they're not connected, therefore I don't even think about it. There are two different things in the context of contextual spillover, for example, that exemplify how it's not just a lack of spillover. I feel like in the literature it seems like it's just this black box of we don't know what's happening, and I think there's more happening than we think, and a lot of other theories from psychology can actually help us explain and understand it a bit more. So I think that's quite interesting as well. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, Caroline. I think Sasha has a question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I do. Thank you, Caroline, firstly, for your research. It was really interesting to hear all that you've done. But my question concerns your measure, which I really like. And my question is more related to, as I get the idea of your measure, you just use 3 boxes that people have to place somehow near the centralized self.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking, if we are trying to consider, for example, meat eaters,
Mm-hmm.
which are not reflected, like, okay, they might place sustainable food somehow, I don't know, far from themselves, but maybe if we include, for example, meat eaters as a box as well, it might show us somehow the difference how they placed it as well, because we can see that they will not change the sustainable food box, but for example they might change meat eaters a bit. And this is already somehow relates to your thought that we just discussed about the lack of information that we have. So might be for me, yeah, I'm just curious why you include just those 3 ones.
Yeah, I mean, this is like, you know, hindsight. I wish I'd done it. I basically, this measure, I mean, I basically was like, oh, I'm quite a visual person. I just include this as like, let's see what happens kind of thing. And I didn't realize that the data I'm getting from it was super interesting. So I didn't include anything around meat eaters and so on. And in hindsight, I wish I'd done it more thoroughly with more like concepts such as meat or vegetarian, or like, you know, you can think of all sorts of other concepts that would be really interesting, more interesting than the ones I have included. But I still found like really interesting stuff. And actually someone she's a PhD student with John Togerson, I think, in Aarhus, is it in Aarhus or in Copenhagen? But anyway, in Denmark, she used this method actually in the context of meat consumption, and she did use more of those terms. So it might be worth, she published a paper on it as well, so it might be worth looking into that as well to see how she's done it, because obviously she saw this and she's like, okay, I can do better, and then she did. So, yeah.
Yeah, but it's still super great that you thought about it, and it shows really interesting results. I do like them as well. So
Yeah.
did you give them this task just in the computer? So these boxes was separately on the one side of the page, for example, on the left side, and the picture of self was somewhere in the right side, and they have to pick them to the picture, or they were already somewhere in the picture?
So this was actually during the interview I did this, and it was paper. So I only sort of, because like photographs aren't so nice, I basically made it, like I copied it and everything. But yeah, so I basically gave them a piece of paper, like just a normal piece of paper with like a little person on it. And then I gave them the 3 terms of the paper, and they took them and then placed it on the piece of paper, and then I took a photograph. Quite old school, but it would be really nice actually to replicate it. I think if you can do it. Well, I'm not a programming person, so I wouldn't know how to do it, but I think it would be really nice to actually do this in a more experimental way, virtually. I think that would be quite a nice thing to do, and maybe even on other topics, just as a method almost, around that. So yeah, but
Thank you.
so, yeah, but yeah, thanks for your feedback and questions.
Okay. Fatiha?
Thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. Like, I guess the most interesting part for me in this research was that you did an actual, like, practical intervention and looked at how it influenced. There's so few research that do this, like, real life interventions, and especially the fact that you manipulated a very kind of, it is very tangible. So you can put a, like, recycling bin in there, but like, how many people are going to pay attention to recycling bins? They can, like, throw them somewhere else, but like, putting it like meat that everyone is going to have a look at this, so it's going to influence everyone. That's really new and great design.
Thank you. Yeah.
So what I had is that so you talked about the negative spillover, and you rightly pointed out that for many people it might be kind of a negative experience, so they're taking away the food, and that's like something that really strikes people. So there can, I don't know, negative association between environmentalism and the fact that environmentalism takes away something I really like or love or whatever. Like, so in this sense, did you look at the results? I mean, not only spillover, but how did it, like, change? Were there more people who had negative spillover, or who were like not negative, not positive, or were there more people who had this, like, integrated this identity? So, like, how results?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And so a lot of it is anecdotal, because what happens, as you can imagine, you do this with real people, and they're not, it's just different to doing a lab experiment, I think. So there was actually a riot, like a small group of people who complained, not to me, but to like the canteen chef. And they wanted a meat week to happen after, and they kind of boycotted. They walked in during the intervention and very loudly declared how they had to go out and buy some ham because there was no meat available. I really, really want to write a paper about it, but it's mostly anecdotal evidence, and it's not because these people didn't talk to me. They didn't want to be part of the study. They didn't want to do an interview with me, right? So I couldn't get the data from them, but I have a lot of notes on this and like anecdotal things, and I have to find a way to write this up so that it's available, I think, for both practitioners and also people who want to do research on this, because I think it's super interesting. I just unfortunately don't have the the systematic collection of evidence that would be needed for a really good scientific paper, a research paper. But yes, there was one person where I had the negative spillover, and it's in the paper, in the one with the method as well, where actually one of the terms after the intervention, she put it off the paper with the mannequin. So it was like, she didn't even put it on the paper because it was so far removed from herself. And she was like, no, this is not me. It has to go really far away. But this is one person, right, who did an interview with me. And a lot of people didn't talk to me because they were like, oh no. They didn't say it to my face. They're British people. They're super polite. But it was very much like, yeah, they didn't want to be complicit in this. So it's a real experience about doing research in the field, and you're like, oh, okay. People seem to really dislike me now because I represent the person who's taking away their meat. And yeah, but you know, there's a lot on that, and I wish there were ways. I mean, I work on different research now, slightly different, because well, I just applied for a job and do different research, but I would really love to one day do something like that again. But then actually, you know, applying everything I learned from it and be like, okay, how can we really find out what's going on in people's heads and have them participate in this and see that, because I think the reactions people gave, that's such an indication of denial and like, I mean, yeah. Like other people as well said like, oh yeah, our colleagues came up at lunchtime, said like, there's no meat, they're making us vegans, like we can't eat in the canteen, and and then we have to eat outside and we have to go elsewhere for the whole week. And people said things like that. So that's clearly, I mean, when people say there's nothing to eat, that's obviously an over-exaggeration of what actually happened. And there was some meat still available, but they overgeneralized and said there's nothing to eat. Well, that's not true. But you know, gives you an indication of what probably did happen.
Yeah, I guess that's a real important, like, practical takeaway from this research, because like,
absolutely,
you don't do a proper like informational campaign before taking away something, it can really backlash, so move people away.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. But I really tried, and I mean, this is also, you know, I mean, research papers are great, but you can't include all of these things often in it. And I did workshops, open workshops, where people could just pop in and sort of look at the menu we were planning, get feedback. We changed it based on that. I did the survey, asked people what they wanted. Like I did everything I felt like I could do. And people just were like, oh, whatever. And then it did happen. They're like, what? You're taking away? We're taking away? We didn't think it would actually happen. It's like, well. So I don't know. It's I don't know what could have been done different. But
I think it's an issue that really deserves attention, and we don't hear a lot about this kind of, you know, protests. We tend to focus again, like we do have the, you know, bias on the positive results of studies, but also, you know, something like this could definitely deserve attention. And also, what can we do with this kind of people? Yeah. Well, I guess, you know, if there are some serious policy measures, as they should actually, you know, probably one day they will be implemented, at least in some of the countries, you know, to cut the carbon emissions and to change diets and other lifestyles. We will definitely, you know, like we did face the protests in France, Yellow Vest protests. We saw what could happen if, you know, fuel duties would be actually proposed to increase. You know, what kind of reactions would that provoke, and how to persuade these people, you know, if regular sort of information provision doesn't work with them, then what will work? That's a serious, because that's a serious barrier that we all will be facing with transition to sustainable lifestyles that we really need right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. And I mean, Yeah, I'm trying. So this is the next paper I'm trying to write up from this. I'm still needing to figure out how I can do it, because it doesn't follow the classical ways of, oh, this is the problem, this is what I did, and this is the results. This is basically like, okay, I tried this, there was a huge backlash, and I didn't collect the data to measure, but I observed this kind of, I mean, it's just a bit difficult, I think. But yeah, it's super interesting. And I think this is kind of a niche, I think, in like also in other behaviors, not just food, where we have to move into, because the people weren't students, they were working class. It's a call center, so they were working class Northern England. It's a certain demographic, mostly men actually as well, who were particularly threatened by this.
They didn't get their Yorkshire puddings.
No, they didn't. They didn't. Exactly. And I mean, I talked to someone who's done not a similar thing, but she has also done a behavior change intervention in the canteen, but at Cambridge University, and it was more around nudging, and she found very different things. And it's like, oh, lovely. And she can publish really amazing things from it, but she didn't have that insight that you would maybe get outside of Cambridge University canteens. That I mean, obviously her research is super valid, but I think, yeah,
that's amazing. That's really amazing. You see all the facets of society, you know, with trying it in different places, and I think it's excellent. I don't know, an ethnographic approach, definitely you can do some kind of ethnographic work with it, you know, even if you haven't observed it formally. I'm sure you have field notes and everything, so that should be absolutely valid as material. That shouldn't be excluded. Yeah, no,
exactly. That's why it's my future suggestions for research. I think somewhat like it would have been nice to do a proper ethnographic study. I mean, I was there during the intervention. I was hiding in the canteen, essentially. I was just sitting there listening in on people talking about the food on the table next to me, just sort of like, but it would have been nice to just have it as proper an ethnographically designed thing, rather than me just being curious and then suddenly realizing, oh, there's a lot happening actually. So
yeah,
but yeah, it's a lot to learn about intervention studies, and they're hard but really interesting.
Does anyone else have questions? Please don't be shy. We still have time, and if you would like to comment on anything.
Sorry, I don't know, how long do you normally do the seminar? So I mean, I can talk a lot more about everything, but I don't know how everyone is for time.
I think we, you know, if there would be anything else that you would like to maybe add now, that would be great. Yeah, we are fine for time.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe just generally we talked a little bit about the intervention, but I mean, now like I only gave you a really small glimpse at the processes that I went through to do the intervention. I think none of the papers actually do it justice yet either. Like in my PhD thesis, I obviously had to write it all down, but a lot of thought goes into it, and it can still go wrong. And I think it's a real issue in a way that there isn't very much in the academic literature about doing real world interventions and also real world pre and post data collection. Because what I found, and I really couldn't find really any, like I think I found one study that sort of I could cite around the dropout, for example. So one of the reasons why my quantitative data isn't really that useful is because I had quite a large dropout, and that's normal apparently. So I had about 250 people in the first one, and then, but like, so to explain a bit more, so the company actually has two sites. So it was actually, we only did the intervention in one city and not in the other. And so I did the survey in both cities, and the interviews only in the one where the intervention took place as well. And And the second time, the survey was in the control group as well, and then in the intervention group. But the dropout was, I think, about 50%, which is apparently normal when you do it like this. But that basically means my data is like, I have like, I think 80 survey responses I can match with the pre and post, which is just not very much, or maybe 100 or something like that. So it's really difficult to do good quantitative analysis on this. And I don't know the way around it really, because I think the setup I had was quite ideal. I had a company that has about 1,000 employees. If you have a response rate of about 25%, which is what I had, of 250 people doing the survey, and then split across 2 different groups, and then you have a 50% dropout, and then you're left with just about 100 people in 2 groups. It's just not enough to do good analysis on it, quantitative analysis. But I don't know how I could have gotten a better setup. You have to have a much bigger company, but I mean, I really don't know how you can do this properly. And I think that is a problem that I think deserves more attention as well. And I did talk at conferences over the past years. I talked to so many people about how difficult it is to do field research and interventions, and how many people have failed ones essentially, where you just don't have the right sample sizes, and it's quite discouraging. But at the same time, we have to be, I think, bold and do this, because that's where, if we want to achieve something with environmental psychology, I think that's one of the things we need to be able to do, give advice on real world interventions. And I think for that we have to go past the lab experiments of the surveys are really valuable. I'm like not saying they're not at all, like they are, but we have to go further. And if we keep failing, we can't get the data for it. I think it's just.
Yeah, do you think it would be helpful to run the same study in different companies? So exactly the same intervention, but in several companies instead of one, and then try to mix the findings, knowing that this is a limitation potentially.
Yeah.
However,
yeah,
or trying a university canteen. Probably university students will be hopefully more accessible. And also it's a larger audience potentially. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think that's a good idea. And I think doing it in different companies, the thing why this was a really good setup, and I feel incredibly lucky that I managed to get them on board, is because they do the food for free. So you don't have to factor in the price of the food. And then, if it's a commercial business, they don't want to do these changes or drastic changes because, they're going to lose out maybe, or stuff like that. So I think that is one thing. But yeah, I mean, university students would be a good option. Then for a sample size, yes. But then you are again with the group of students who tend to be middle class and young. And I think there is real value in going somewhere which is a bit more, I don't know, sticky. And, but yeah, I really don't know. But I think it's maybe it needs, I mean, I was on my own being a PhD student, which gives you all the freedom, but it also, you're very limited in the resources you have. So I think if you put in a bigger thing, a bigger grant with more researchers on it, have the company, within it from the get-go, I think that would be a whole different thing. I think that's maybe how to do it, to be honest. To get a company on board from the beginning and sort of test lots more things, such as, I don't know, the weight of the food or the sales. If you pay for the food, the sales data, there's lots more data you could collect. That would be super interesting as well. But it wasn't really feasible for my PhD.
In terms of contextual work factors, I also think if we, for example, might give the respondents, the people who work there, the idea that the canteen is, for example, closing and we just reopen the new one. I think maybe the dropped out might be, the percent of dropped out might be different, because the people will perceive it contextually as a different canteen, and there is a different rules and they will adapt them slightly better as well. Might be interesting for me to look at the difference like that.
Yeah.
So for example, it's a student canteen and we just can say that, okay, the owner of this canteen changed, so we changed the menu and everything.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a good idea, yeah. I think one thing that might be interesting more generally is to think of how we can work with the context, is kind of what you're hinting at as well, the context, and then design interventions around it, rather than going with, oh, this is what the literature says, and now we have to really try to apply it, but sort of work with what we have and how to, yeah, and then see how we can interpret this at like different factors. I think that would be an interesting approach. So, because I also think that interventions do need to be tailored. You can't just do one thing and then apply to everywhere. It needs to, that's just what I personally believe anyway, is that it's nice to empower people and have them included, and it makes it, you know, more workable, and sort of almost do action research around it, or something like that. And then you work with the people and the context and see what you can get at. Which is also something that is not being done in the area of environmental psychology that much. I think it's often, this is not necessarily a criticism, but I think it's a critical reflection of how in the area of environmental psychology, and this is how I've been trained. So I did a master's in that area and my PhD essentially as well, where we are very much doing applied social psychology very often. And I think it has its place, but I think we have to be aware that methodologically and from an impact perspective, we have to go beyond that and see what else we can do and what other areas we can tap into to sort of, make environmental psychology an interesting field for policymakers and what contributions we can make. So
I think it's absolutely crucial.
Yeah,
we just don't do this enough at all.
No, and yeah, I mean, I guess there are lots of discussions to be had on where you can publish it and like what some research groups are focusing on who are very dominant, and which is, you know, just I guess sometimes how the field then develops in that. But, yeah.
There is one possibility. Let's think about this for future. So we have, you know, our BA program has two options for the sort of, what's it called? Not term work, but the final work that they write. So for the 4th year, yes, that's the last one, BA here. So there is a possibility to do a normal research, yeah, and they normally, our students, you know, they try to orient them towards, and almost, you know, many of them actually publish their thesis at the end, BA thesis. But also there is a second option, which is more practice oriented. And we could think for next year. So if we got in touch, for instance, if you just reminded me sort of in September, because that's when we start to collect, to put together our proposals, you know, potential topics for supervision. we could try and think something around this, and we would have a student who, if anyone would be interested, we could, link that, with our interests, discuss this and so on. I think it's possible, and, we could at least try it. If you wanted to do so, we would essentially have someone who speaks a good English, so that, we could work together with the person. And then see, I mean, our research group would definitely be interested, I'm very much interested in interventions, and, I have conducted quite a lot of work on big interventions, like we saw it's more of natural experience than the interventions that we have designed for the purpose of the work. But, that's connecting with practice is one of our biggest priorities, I think. And we would all be interested, so we could think, in future, how we can integrate, collaborations with you. If you are interested really in continuing this kind of work, we could definitely, discuss it as a group as well one day, and see how, I'm sure, some other people would have interest in this. Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, in CAST as well, that's the research center I'm in now. There is the whole theme around interventions. I don't work in that one, but so Stuart Capstick and Wouter Portinger are like that. They're doing a lot of work, I think, more around mobility. But this is very early stage, so I don't know. So basically, I put in a grant application with some other researchers on sort of working together with farmers and supermarkets and developing a whole intervention with them. So, we don't know if that grant proposal comes through, but if it did, that'd be amazing, because I think there's a real appetite for, if you frame it more around transforming food systems or transforming lifestyles around food choices, and if you take in other things such as the health aspect, I didn't talk about it at all, but particularly in food, that there's a huge overlap. I think there's a lot to be done. I think as environmental psychologists, we can actually really contribute a lot to it. This is sort of my area of passion, so I always wanted to work on it.
Well, we should definitely continue the discussion then, and let us know also how your project goes with Stuart and Wouter, because we all work together. So definitely interested in continuing this work, and as our group grows, I'm sure that we can create many things. Veronica just replied, I think that she didn't know that there was this second option for the fourth year, to produce, instead of a classical thesis, to produce something more practice oriented. So potentially, we can discuss it with her, or anything, around these lines would be really interesting and great. Also, because my personal opinion, I'm trying to think whether we should also link more with businesses, because I'm a little bit skeptical about policies in general, because it's politics, it's really linked to politics. We've seen that with the Healthy Towns program, for example, in which we have worked, how there was a change in government in the middle of our project. So I think it passed from leftists to conservatives, and that has totally changed the priorities in terms of obesity being on the list. And then it came back again. So policy is totally biased in terms of politics. Politicians speak about themselves, that we are politicians, and don't forget that. And also they're extremely slow to develop. So potentially interventions, trying intervention and action research could provide a new ground to, just developing this area of interventions that we crucially need. We cannot just rely on governmental policies. That's what I'm trying to say. And, natural experiments, because there are not many initiatives, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. I was so thankful that I had the opportunity to collaborate with a company. They weren't very invested, I have to say. They sort of just let me do my thing, and that's it. But I've been and this is ages ago, and I wasn't in the right state to sort of make anything from it. But I went to this event where businesses, so practitioners, businesses and researchers came together and talked about food changes. And I sat at a table with this lady from IKEA, and she's like, oh yeah, like we really want some researchers to help us. All they're doing is trial and error to sort of completely transform the food that they are sort of having in their global kind of kitchens. But I think two things are difficult there. One is, as researchers, that we are really slow, and we take our time to develop things and to sort of, do everything and evaluate it properly. And then it's also important to speak the same language and to reach out. And I think sometimes it's very difficult to reach out. But I think there is a real appetite for it. It's just sort of how to get at the same speed and speak the same language. But I think establishing these connections and then finding a way to collaborate is incredibly useful and incredibly rewarding as well. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Excellent. So yeah, definitely we should be in touch, and we can be in touch and discuss this in future. I think it could be interesting to
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Okay. Are there any other comments or questions before we finish? Okay. In that case, thank you so much again, Caroline, for coming today and talking to us. It's been really interesting. A lot of food for thought, for development. So yeah, please come back again.
Yes, yeah. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's so good to see that you're really enthusiastic and to see another research group coming up on the topic. So it's great.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, we'll be in touch. And I mean, if you ever have any questions about any of this, just drop me an email.
Yeah, we definitely will. So we're also posting, I think, our seminars. Fatiha is doing this, posting our seminar series on Twitter. So anyone, please feel free to join, the next events. We'll also have, I think, Lorraine Whitmar just confirmed for 10th of June. Yeah, is that correct?
Yes, 10th of June.
Understood correctly, yeah. So, and there will be many probably other talks, as we go. So this is it. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Caroline. And thank you, everyone, for coming and for your questions and discussions. So, and see you again.
See you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
And Kingsley, Veronica, Sasha, we will have our meeting, NUG meeting, maybe in 5 minutes. Shall we give ourselves 5-10 minutes break? And we meet on our regular link to discuss the scale. Okay, take care.
Okay.
Okay.